All right, historians, welcome to our first official workshop on what is oral history and how to write the questions. So we've already begun a little bit of the training. You've already, as a class, done some reading on what oral history is, and you've done some background research on your narrators and or the communities and contexts from which they come. But today, I want to get you started on how to write your questions. This is a two-part training, so you're only going to be responsible for the first half of it. I'm going to walk you through the elements that you are going to complete before I see you in class again, or before we meet again. And I'll also kind of give you an overview of some of the upcoming aspects that we're going to be working on. So you'll notice that we cover some things and I go back and forth between the PowerPoint, which I'm sharing right here, and in addition, there's also a series of handouts that you will be linked in Canvas, and you'll have physical copies as well. And so these are some of the things that you're going to be working on today on your own and in class. Okay, so this is the Writing the Questions workshop, oral history workshop, writing meaningful interview questions. Before we get started, I want to come back to some of those questions that we discussed as a class a few weeks ago. What do you think oral history is? When we began this as a class, we thought about oral reports about history or the oral transmission of historical events. And some of that is true, but you as a class also came up with some more specific definitions about oral history. What do you want to learn about oral history in this class? And then these are the learning outcomes today, the things that we're going to be discussing as a group via this webinar as well as in person. So today you're going to be discussing the basic aspects of oral history: interviewing, archiving, researching, and sharing. You're going to be learning how to analyze an individual in historical context. Historical context is probably the key, most important aspect of doing oral history. It's not just about interviewing someone and writing down their answers. It's about analyzing who they are as an individual, but also as a historical actor. You're going to learn a little bit about contacting your narrator and scheduling interviews. You are not responsible to do that or accomplish that today, but it's something you'll learn about so you know what to expect down the road. You've already conducted some background research, so we'll talk about that and the importance of background research. You're going to interpret our informed consent and best practices for ethical oral history. You'll learn a little bit about what it's like for your narrator to give their consent of their story and to share that over with you, a student, that in many cases they don't know you and you have to explain to them why you should be trustworthy. But the most important thing you're going to do today is you're going to write and review a few successful interview questions. When we meet again, we'll actually practice some of those questioning techniques, and you'll finish out your draft questions for your interview. Okay? All right, are you ready to get started? Let's do it. So let's begin. Think back on those questions I just asked you. What do you think oral history is? If you have your handout with you, go ahead and pause the tape and write your answer in those blank spots. What do you think oral history is? And once you've done that, play it and pause again. What do you want to learn about oral history? And that can be, what do you want to learn about oral history in this class, in this workshop, or as a future historian, which some of you might want to be. When you're done, get the tape back started and we can go again. Okay, so I have linked this PowerPoint in Canvas for you or in the webinar for you. So if you want to listen to this sample interview, you may. If you do not have time to do so, you do not have to. But if you have a chance to, click on the little icon. It's about 14 minutes long. And you can hear the sample interview provided for you. I want you to be thinking about, what do you learn from this interview? Who's the narrator? When was the interview conducted? Who are the student and or faculty researchers? And what do you think went well? Okay, so we've talked a little bit about your learning outcomes, but here's the outline of what we're going to be working on today. You began already with your introduction, what oral history means to you, and then I'm going to do a little introduction on what oral history teaches us. Then we'll talk a little bit about your narrator as a historical actor and placing them in historical context. As I mentioned, you'll learn a little bit about scheduling and contacting your narrator. I'm going to give you a checklist for conducting your interviews before, during, and after. And with that includes some additional paperwork and forms. You're going to write some questions, and then you're going to practice, and then you're going to submit your questions for approval. So that's what we're working on today. Do you feel ready? Okay, great. So, what oral history teaches us? Think back to those questions that you answered in your handout. What you think oral history is, and what did you want to learn about oral history? And so I've given you my answer here about what I think oral history can teach us. All of these skills are contributing to your education while also influencing your personal awareness, understanding of lifespan, and enhancing knowledge about older adults, as well as the significance of our historical community. So think back to that first assignment you did where you interviewed somebody from your life. That maybe didn't teach you a ton about historical backgrounds of, the state we live in or the city we live in, but you learned a little bit about your friend or your family member, and it probably gave you something to think about when you interact with that person again. Oral history does that for us when it comes to history. It humanizes the historical experience. You realize that history isn't just a long timeline of events and names and dates, that it's the actions of human beings who have shaped the world we live in now. It's incredibly powerful. So for me, this is what oral history teaches us. The other thing it teaches us, think about it. If you're in a class on Arizona history, or Mexican American history, or African American history, or women's history, right? You're learning about these major historical events. For example, let's say we're learning about Arizona history and we're learning about statehood, right? Well, that's a political event. That's a kind of a national, main, big scale event. But wouldn't you like to know about the guy who was standing in Nogales the day that the very first border fence was ever actually erected? Wouldn't you want to hear his story about how it felt to be there? What went down when guns started going off and there was confusion over which side of the border he was supposed to be on? Doesn't it make it so much richer for you if you hear the story from one person's perspective if they were actually there, right? Think about a time somebody may have said, don't believe everything you hear, don't believe everything you read. I was there. This is what oral history does for us. If you're learning about Arizona history or Mexican American history, you're learning from someone who was there. But sometimes people don't know or consider themselves as historical actors. They just think of themselves as like any other regular Joe. Think about when you interviewed somebody at the beginning of the class. Some of them might have been like, why do you want to interview me? What do I know? But there's a depth and richness of life that comes with each individual experience. So with that, I want to move on to our next topic, and that is your narrator in historical context. I'm going to read this text to you, and then I'm going to show you the handout. I'm going to show that to you first, and then I'll read the text to you. So this is You Try. It's called You Try, historical context. The notes you see in your handout are going to mirror what I read to you. An individual's life can illustrate systems at play in his or her environment. As you research, you may find out a lot of specific information on your narrator. They may be someone who has a lot of content out there. Or you may hit a wall. You may not learn anything about them while you're doing background research. But that doesn't mean that one interview will be better than the other. As you begin to construct your oral history, imagine that you are telling this person's life as if they are a historical actor. So below on your handout, you'll see there's a series of things I've listed for you that have shaped this person. And it's possible that they've shaped this as well. So their family origins, right? The occupation of their parents, the family birth order, siblings, migration stories. All of these things can tell us about historical eras like the Great Depression or the baby boomer generation or the hippies of the 1960s, the Cultural Revolution, the Civil Rights era, urban poverty, mass migration movements through the United States. Any any one person's story can align, their family story can align with a historical trend. So you as a historian are trying to trace, are they falling within this story frame or are they a little bit of an outlier? The next thing is spirituality. We'll ask a question at some point in the interview about your narrator's spirituality. That might be really direct with someone who's a member of the clergy, like talk to me about your church, for example. But it might be a little bit more obscure with someone who maybe doesn't identify as religious or spiritual. But there's still something that's really encouraging them to live a certain way. So I ask a lot about mentors, right? Their moral or spiritual guides. This tells us a lot about the structures in their community. So say a person was born in pretty much abject poverty. They lived, very close to destitute, but they went to school every single day. They never missed a day of school. This can tell us a lot about that person's value of education. It can also tell us a lot about maybe their teachers were their only source of stability and support in their young lives. You're going to ask them something about politics, believe it or not. You just might not frame it that way. We want to learn about their activism, their charity or volunteer work. What did they do to promote certain issues? What were some specific near and dear issues? I can think of one particular staff member we interviewed who used that opportunity to talk about the importance of domestic violence and abuse training and research because she lost her daughter to a situation of domestic violence. So we would have never known that about her and about her passions if we hadn't asked questions about her family. Social, some of you are athletes, right? So this is a great opportunity to learn about sports and recreation. People who are brought up as athletes tend to have coaches and mentors that they consider as some of their most important people in their lives. Organizations, were they part of a dance troupe? Did they volunteer and then they became members of a board or something? Do they have a certain social position, standing, class, community involvement? And then the last two tend to tell us a lot about where this person comes from and how their lives have changed over time. So geography, where has he or she lived? Some of the physical and demographic information can tell us a lot about their geography in terms of class, like where in the city do they live versus where did they work. I love to ask, one of my favorite questions is, how has South Phoenix changed, right? Because in my perspective, South Phoenix hasn't changed much in the last 4 or 5 years that I've been working here. But to someone who's been working in South Phoenix for 40 years, this community is almost unrecognizable than it was in 1979 or 1980. So you can learn a lot about how old they are. You can learn a lot about what they've done over the years. And you can learn a lot about the community just by asking a question about geography. And then economic. You'll never ask a narrator, like, how much money do you make, right? Or like, are you middle class? You'll never ask someone that, but you'll ask about their education. How many degrees do they own or have they earned? Usually tells us a lot about their education. Marriage, divorce, family life, careers, all of that gives us an idea of the economic profile that this person is building. So there's a lot you can learn about a narrator by just asking general questions. So I want you to try. You should have a handout. It says, you try at the bottom. Using the dots as potential components of your life, draw or write aspects of your own historical context. So here you are. You're this big circle right here, you, right? Any one of these little circles, if you think it's a major influence in your life, for example, my family of origin, my mom, my dad, and my sister are the most important structures in my life that led me to become the woman that I am. So I would use one of these big circles to tell about my family of origin. My dad was a football coach. Both my parents were teachers. I was the youngest, right? Those tell you a lot about the significance of education in my life, as well as the role I played in my family dynamic. Maybe in this other one, I would tell you a little bit about the education that I have or the geography. I grew up in a rural town in Colorado that over the course of my young life from 2 to 14 went from a dirt road, septic system only rural community to an exploding suburb south of Denver that ultimately overnight became almost unrecognizable to me. So I went from being, kind of a rough and tumble farm girl tomboy to living in the middle of a city without ever having moved. And then in my teens, we relocated to Phoenix. So you can learn a lot about me as well as rural Colorado, suburban Colorado, and ultimately suburban Phoenix just by tracing my story. You can learn about those communities as well. So go ahead and pause the tape. Use the part up here as a point of reference. Here you are in the middle. Point to some of these big influencers: family, spirituality, work, school, and then maybe these little ones, right? Like, do you identify maybe as like a certain faith that is important, but maybe not huge to you? Or maybe you really know what, like I like this one that's kind of far away. Maybe you know a little bit about your race and your racial heritage, but you don't see it as super important to you, but you know it might have something to do with your orbit. Go ahead and pause the tape, fill that out, just scribble and write, and come back to me when you're done. Okay, so when we meet again in class, we're going to talk about you as a historical actor, you in a historical context. And I want to remind you of the project that we're working on for this class and this major project. So our goal for the South Phoenix Oral History Project is to concentrate on the history of South Phoenix. It's never been written. Academically and popular, there's no history built on the community that we live in and work in right now. So your narrators are actually starring in a way, right? They're starring role in a way that allows them to be the central observer and narrator depicting events that they've recognized on the timeline of South Phoenix existence. So your historical knowledge, what you're learning in class about, not about your narrator, but about Arizona history, Mexican American history, African American history, you're actually creating a place for your narrator to be a part of a major history, right? A general history. You're giving them voice to their own historical impact. So here's an example. When a Mexican American narrator tells you that she arrived in Arizona in 1953 when she was 25 years of age, you might, if you're me, you get excited because you realize, oh my gosh, you can cover the agricultural empire of the South Basin, right? Oh, I know in the 1950s, South Phoenix was an agricultural, it was an empire. It was huge. Cotton fields, cattle grazing, citrus groves. After about 1955, you have the Japanese flower gardens. So if she's living in South Phoenix, she's 25 years of age, and her parents, she might mention, were migrant laborers. Boom, you've got an instant connection to something you know is happening in South Phoenix in the post-war. You might also learn about migration patterns because she might tell you about them moving around through the Southwest. Maybe she and her family lived briefly in the Golden Gate barrio, or maybe she moved to the new housing development of Laveen and Ahwatukee. Maybe she tells you how her family wasn't able to buy or rent property in central or north Phoenix. That's because there was something called redlining, which means it was illegal for people of color to even buy or rent property north of the Salt River. She might remember things about the construction of South Mountain Community College. If she's been here since 1953, 25, 30 years later, they were building this campus. So she saw it get built. Wouldn't you want to know that? Wouldn't you want to know about what she thought of the school? Did she think it was going to be a good school? Did she think it would make it? Did it matter at all? Did she even notice, right? You could learn about the business development. Where'd she shop? Where did she go to church? Where did she eat? Of course, you can always ask her her personal history about her occupation or her spouses, her children, churches, clubs, etc., and any other forces along the journey. So think about yourself. What did you write when I had you try for yourself? You probably have something to share about the history of your community just by talking about your own life. Okay, so if you need to, take a break, come back, and we're going to talk a little bit about scheduling appointments with your narrator. Okay, are we ready? All right, so this is a guide, just be yourself. Below, I've listed all of the things that you should cover when you communicate with your narrator. All of you should have this handout, and we're going to follow along as well with the PowerPoint. So the good news is all of the scheduling gets done through my office. So I schedule all of the narrators directly. And so this is the guideline and template that I follow. If you happen to come across someone, you have a parent, a grandparent, a family member, or a friend in the community who you think would be excellent for this project, this is a great guide. It's just a general guide though, so be yourself, but my hope is that you know all of this information before you propose they join the project. So take a look at your handout and you'll see this is what I tell every single narrator who we recruit to be interviewed. I begin with who I am and my role in the project. Hi, I'm Dr. Summer Sherland. I'm at South Mountain Community College, and I'm the founder of the South Phoenix Oral History Project. You might say, I'm a student researcher working with Dr. Sherland in the South Phoenix Oral History Project. Right there, you've got the name of the project, right? The purpose of the project. Our purpose, our vision is to capture and preserve the history of South Phoenix, right? Or you might say, we're looking to celebrate the 40th anniversary of South Mountain Community College. Kind of depends on who you're talking to. The very best thing you can do is send them to our website, southphoenixoralhistory.com, so that they can take a look for themselves who's already been interviewed. The fact that we have 50 names of people who've already been interviewed helps people say that they'd be interested in our project. We explain how the interviews will be used. We're looking to interview people who can tell us about the history of South Phoenix and South Mountain. We're using the interviews as part of public and academic publication and promotion. For example, upcoming, we have a documentary premiere. We explain that the interviews are housed through our office. If there are any exceptions, we cover that in the consent form. I typically tell them that it takes about an hour. Most interviews last between 50 minutes and an hour and 25, but we really shoot for an hour. And I tell them that the interviews take place in the CTL studio on Tuesday or Thursday mornings, or whenever we have the studio scheduled. And you might tell them, I have class on a Tuesday or Thursday morning, so we probably do the interview at that time. So typically whenever you and I meet as a class, that's when you would be interviewing someone. But remember, I do most of this for you behind the scenes. You also need to tell them up front that some of these things are going to happen. I will ask that you sign a consent form giving me the right to use your interview for educational and research purposes. I will also be sending you a biographical questionnaire. It is meant to help me craft meaningful questions. Send it back to me before the interview. It is private. It's usually like their address. I'll share that with you in a moment. Their family occupation, their parents' occupations, etc. It is for my research purposes only. A lot of times narrators do not fill this form out, and that is okay. And then I explain that by including you, narrator, we will acquire a more complete, detailed picture for us at South Phoenix and South Mountain Community College. So once that's done, this is your assignment coming up as the student researcher or the interviewer. You will then confirm with your narrator. You'll contact your narrator by phone call or email. Most prefer a phone call because they're a little older usually, but you would follow up with an email too. Confirm the time, date, and location, and establish a meeting location with them. So I'll say, we'll be interviewing you on the 20th in the CTL studio at our library. I will meet you at the help desk at the library at 8:15. We'll walk up to the library or to the studio together. I share the consent form with him or her once more just to be sure. I include the biographical form and ask them to return it. And then I provide my my contact information. For students, I want you to copy me and include a screenshot of this contact information, just so I know for sure that your interview is scheduled and your narrator knows where you are, okay? So you can see right here is an example of a screenshot of the interview reminder that I sent to one of our narrators. All right. You have another handout called Checklist for Interviewer. We will go over this as a class, but these are all the things that I encourage you to bring with you to your interview. And there are a few that you must do in order to be a successful oral historian. The very first thing is bring a blank consent form. It is very likely your narrator will forget to sign and print their consent form. It is not their responsibility as the person giving this gift to you to also bring the consent form. It is your responsibility as the interviewer to collect the consent form so that this gift of an interview can be counted as part of our collection. If you're a student, you should have already signed a talent release form. And then if you are the researcher, you should have a list of questions. If you're a student, those questions should be approved by one of the faculty researchers. Okay, upon the interview, Get there early. Do not waste their time. Some of these folks are retired and have all day to hang out, but they get anxious if they can't find you. They get nervous. A lot of these people are professionals and have scheduled time away from their busy days. Some of them have to take a half day from work or sick time or personal time. So if you're late and they're early, you are automatically set up to make them uncomfortable and upset and you uncomfortable and nervous. Get there early, chat a little bit. Be sure to meet them in your arranged location. Ask them immediately for the signed forms or give them a provided blank right then and there. You'll set up the equipment as your interviewee completes the biographical questionnaire if they haven't already. Typically, one of your faculty researchers will be in the studio with you, so they'll be setting up the microphone and the lights and all that. And then I always like to start with ground rules. I explain my role and my style. I say, I am a very active listener, so you will hear me nod, you'll hear me, oh yeah, right. I tell them I'm gonna do that. And then I'm trying really hard to refrain from responding to your stories so that I don't mess up the cues, right? It's important that you tell your narrator that they are allowed to ask to stop or pause the interview at any time. It is their right and it is their privilege to share their story as they like. They do not need to feel uncomfortable at any point in the interview. I myself have several times stopped an interview when a narrator has asked me to do so. Of course, as a researcher, I don't ever want to stop the tape because I don't want to forget what it is they're telling me, but this is their sensitive story. And so it's my role to protect that person's interests. So, conducting the interview, begin recording. Begin recording as soon as possible because oftentimes your narrators will begin telling you a story before you ever get a chance to ask them a question. So try to get that recording going. If you're a student and you're not, working with the equipment the way the faculty are, do a backup. I put one right on my phone. I'll show you the name of the app. It's under Samsung. So if you have an iPhone, it might be different, but it's just called Voice Recorder. See that? All you do is hit this red button and it starts recording and it saves as an MP3 file. So I just, boom, hit it and I let them go and it picks up all the conversation. That way, if anything ever happens to the initial recording, you have a backup, which is your grade and your product and your research. So you want to have a backup. You always begin the session with your name and your location. So I am Dr. Summer Sherland. We are at South Mountain Community College. It is February 20th, 2020, and we are interviewing Jerome Garrison and Liz Warren. The reason you say that is because at some point down the road, someone may want to use your interview and they may want to reference your academic work that you created. And this way, they have your information and they know when and where the interview was conducted. And then ask your questions in order. Do not stress out if they answer your questions before you ask them, or if they kind of meander a little bit. This is a human conversation, an interaction that you're having with this person, and you can't always control the way it goes. It's like any other conversation. When you get to the end of the interview, I always ask them, is there anything you'd like to add about, and then I give them lots of time, about South Phoenix, about South Mountain. I ask them, do you think that we should interview? Typically they'll say someone like, oh, so-and-so, you should really talk to Raul Cardenas. He's the founding president. And if we haven't already interviewed him, which we have in this case, but if you haven't, I always say, would you be able to put me in touch with Raul Cardenas? And then they say yes, and then, we go from there. Collect all signed forms. Do not forget your consent form. Do not forget your consent form. Do not forget your consent form. Without your consent form, your interview is null and void, which means your grade is affected. If you're not doing this for a grade, you're just interviewing, that's fine, but we can never use that content without the consent of your narrator. Double check you have your address and email information. We mail a copy to all of our narrators of their interview and their consent forms. Without their address, we cannot send that information. So it's your responsibility as the interviewer to get that content. Thank them, offer to follow up, and end the recording. You can do this. So this is the checklist. We'll go over this again in class, but this gives you an idea of what you'll be doing before and during the interview. So, each of you has been assigned a narrator. I want you to take a moment and using your little, the blank space at the bottom of that checklist, just write a sample question, any question about your narrator that you would like to know. Here's some things of topics that I would suggest that you use. Early life, childhood, hometown, family, education, career or trajectory, their views on South Mountain Community College or South Phoenix, historical context, relevant to our class, and legacies, future words of wisdom. So pause the tape, write a sample question, and come on back to me when you're ready. Okay, are you ready? All right. I mentioned to you that you will be getting a copy of the biographical questionnaire. So this is something I share with your narrators when they agree to be interviewed. You can see I say thank you for agreeing to share your story. We will be creating meaningful questions about your life. In order to create relevant questions, we'd like to know a little bit about you first. So this gets sent to them in advance. Oftentimes our narrators do not fill this out, but when they do, you can see year you arrived in Arizona, where you spent your childhood, date and place of marriage, your role at South Mountain. All of these things can help you craft a meaningful question about any one of those topics that you just brainstormed, but not all the time. And that's okay. So I want you to, we're going to practice in class, but I want to show you an example of a question and then a follow-up sort of approach. So this is a good example with a woman named Chris Haynes that we interviewed in spring 2019. And the question I asked her was, what were some of the most challenging jobs you faced? Chris had been through a lot of different career paths in education, and so she had had lots of different jobs. So I wanted to know, like, what were the most challenging? Her answer was cool because she emphasized how every step along the way, every time she was offered an opportunity, she just said yes. She said, you know what, I'm going to try. Yes. So I thought, okay, even if she feels unprepared, this is a woman who is willing to risk. So I followed up. I said, okay, in terms of saying yes to so many opportunities, have you suffered at all on a personal level to find balance? Her answer was super raw, and it was very unexpected because she talked about the expectations that she faced throughout her adult life placed on her because as a woman, there was an expectation that she become a mother. And she talked about the historical evolution from the 1970s into the 2000s. Again, she didn't use the historical language that we as historians do, but she talked about it from her own life experiences about evolving as a career woman and then feeling like she needed to have it all through motherhood and family life, and then getting to a place where she felt like she had truly achieved some balance with or without a family. And I mean, she had a family, but with or without a traditional family in the sense that you might think. So you should in your handouts have question practice, right? So if we were in class and we'll do this together, you might get assigned one of these questions. Family life in Phoenix, South Mountain Community College. Try writing a meaningful interview question that might get them to talk about one of these P's. Get them to talk about people, place, problem, progress, or point. Talk about other people they've worked with. Talk about a place that they lived, grew up, or worked. Talk about a problem they faced. For Chris, that was, did you ever struggle to find balance, right? Talk about progress. Maybe how did you get from your first job as an IT help desk worker all the way to running your own media lab and studio? Or point. Maybe at the end of the interview, often we ask about their vision for the future or their legacy they hope to leave behind. And that's a really good question about point. Like, what's the point of life? Kind of, what's the purpose of life? So go ahead and pause again if you want to revisit those questions that you already took a stab at, and see if your questions provide an opportunity for a narrator to really delve into their story. Okay, so your last handout is called Questions for Approval. When I see you next, I want you to bring to me at least 15 questions with potential follow-ups. And I do this because it's like, they're in like parentheses, they're in brackets. 15 questions is more than enough for an hour-long interview. It's probably a little too many. And a follow-up question is only necessary if they don't answer the question or if they lead you down another path than what you expected. If you try to write 30 questions, 15 questions and 15 follow-ups, your interview will last for 75 hours and you'll ask way too many in-depth questions and your narrator might get confused. So note down here, again, those same themes: background, what's their family origin story, where did they grow up, what was their childhood like, early life, right? What was school like? Who were they like in school? And did they play sports? Did they play music? Were they artistic? Were they writers? All of that. What was their family life like in Phoenix whenever they did arrive here? What do they know about South Phoenix or South Mountain Community College? What was their education or career path? What are some of their proudest achievements? And what's a vision they may have for the future? So these are your 15 questions. You're going to draft these for me, and then you're going to bring them to me for my approval. So when you see me next, bring these questions. Now, I'm not going to leave you high and dry. If you're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea how to write these questions, in the PowerPoint, there is a question bank. These are, over the course of the last 3 years, I have found that these tend to be the most successful questions that students ask and narrators answer. You are more than welcome to use the question bank to craft your 15 to 16 meaningful questions. So I love this one. We've heard that some people were resistant to the idea of opening a community college in South Phoenix. Do you have any opinion as to why that might be? Right? Or I really like, this one was really nice. If you could share one part of your story, remember that question about point? If you could share one part of your story to students, with students who are struggling with academic, personal, or financial challenges, what would you hope to say to them? Good, right? So your job is to paint this person's story. You're looking from of their story as a history, from beginning to end. And end is today. End is 2020 or 21 or whatever year we're in. So from their childhood all the way to now. That's your job in the interview. After the interview, as the researcher, as the historian, your job is to take this person's life and paint the story around it so you're able to understand who this person was and what the world was like when they were living in it, okay? Before you go, last thing, I want to show you what the informed consent form looks like. It's in your handouts. We didn't cover it because it's already created, but it's up there a few pages up. This is the informed consent that your narrators are required to sign in order for us to use their interview. And you as the researcher are required to get a copy of this. It can potentially affect your grade if you're doing this for a class. If you don't have a consent form, you technically don't have an interview, which means you don't have your final project. So take a look at it, make sure you agree to all the things in it, and you can talk with me more if you have any questions. All right, so reminder, when I see you again, these are the things I want you to have filled out. Your handout, what do you think oral history is? What did you want to learn about oral history? I want you to do the you try historical context, put yourself in historical context using examples from above or others. And I want you to bring me all the way at the bottom a list of 15 questions with potential follow-ups. Okay? If you have questions, you let me know. Do the best you can, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Nice work.